Simulator Interactive, that's a nonprofit, and the Business School of MIT, MIT Sloan Business School. It was designed for instant turnaround. So it makes a number of shortcuts from the computational point of view. It is not very well spatially resolved. Don't ask for what's going to happen in India. It's really directed at that one number. What is the temperature going to be in 2100, global average temperature? It reproduces all the known data for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It reproduces supercomputer models that have all sorts of temporal and spatial resolution it doesn't have. And it has aspects of its simulation approximations completely open. There's a 400-page online manual. If you're wonky enough to want to look at it, you can download it. Anyone can download it and see how they do all they do. As an example of how it compares to other more sophisticated models, here's 6 different supercomputer models. This is the amount of CO2 pumped into the air per year over the 21st century from 2000 to 2100. Here are 6 different assumptions about how humans respond. These 6 messages, simulations, produce spaghetti plots that are indicated by symbols. And the solid line is the En-ROADS representation of the same conditions. So you see that En-ROADS sort of falls within the spaghetti plots, which is one of many measures that I could show, showing that it represents reasonably well what's known about the environment. En-ROADS has been involved in thousands of presentations worldwide. About half the US Senate and a third of the US House have seen this simulation in action. There's a 9-class training program with homework and help desks that I've taken. You could take it, anyone can take it. In taking it, I met people from Nigeria, Colombia, and Toronto, and Southern California, all who are taking these tests, these training courses. With or without training, you can do everything I'm doing today. All you have to do is Google En-ROADS simulator. You'll find it. You can use it. You can go home and do it. This is an interactive presentation. You select the policies. We estimate their effectiveness in lowering the temperature. We run the simulation to see if our estimates were correct. And we have some discussion if it's a surprise. Okay, now on to navigating En-ROADS. Before that, I stick in this slide, which is really unnecessary for you, because League of Women Voters is well aware of this, but I've been surprised how necessary it is for other audiences. In democracies, behavioral change requires voter pressure on elected representatives. Lots of people are amazed that this is what we should be doing. While I won't go into any details about that, the overall way to look at this is extreme weather motivates us all to tell our elected officials that climate change is a concern for us. Where En-ROADS comes in is the second step. En-ROADS empowers you to tell your elected officials what you think ought to be done about it, because it gives you a chance to evaluate what things are effective and what things aren't effective. And finally, this has been done before on a much smaller scale. Catalytic converters, the replacement of the DDT insecticides, and CFC replacements, all represented citizen action that caused the federal government to set up a framework within which private enterprise competed to develop improved environmental products. That's basically what we're doing about climate change, but on a much larger scale. All right, now on to navigation. We're trying to navigate this website. This is the home page of En-ROADS. So it has a top part that has to do with the state of the economy and the environment. And it has a bottom part that has 18 different types of policies that you can manipulate. And when you manipulate them, the economy and the environment change on the top. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what all these possibilities are. So on the top, the thing that's on the left is energy production in the 21st century. It has here on the horizontal scale, the 21st century from 2000 to 2100. Is this getting in the way? Don't worry about that. has energy production in the 21st century. The dark brown is coal. The red is oil. The blue is natural gas. The green is renewable energies. That would be solar, wind, hydroelectric, tidal. The magenta is bioenergy. You grow stuff and you consume it to produce energy, and then you regrow it again. In the Midwest, that would be growing corn for ethanol. And the light blue that you can barely see on the top, that's nuclear energy. The middle box here is when all that stuff happens, this is the amount of CO2 that's pumped into the air every year. Against, the whole 21st century. And when that happens, this is the change in temperature from pre-industrial levels that occurs because of this amount of energy production producing that amount of CO2, which leads to that kind of change in temperature. This is in centigrade. If your favorite temperature is Fahrenheit, it's 6.5 degrees. So our goal is to get that number to go down. What I put up here is business as usual. The current policies, not the current promises that are made at some conference, but the actual policies that exist across the world, produce this amount of projected energy, which produces that amount of projected CO2, which produces that temperature. You can see that the first 20 years we already know about. And you can see here a little dip. That dip's the pandemic. So this part isn't projection. It's this part that's projection. And that's the part that can be changed by policies. Now let's go to the policy side. That's the bottom hand. Policy is governed by supply and demand. The easiest thing to understand first is demand. So demand comes from four different things, really. Transportation, buildings and industry, and population growth or economic growth. Each one of these has a line with a black dot. The black dot's at status quo, but it's a slider. You can move this dot back and forth. That's what I'm going to do. You tell me what policy, I'm going to move this dot back and forth. If you go this direction, you increase, in this case, the energy efficiency in buildings and industry. If you go in this direction, you decrease. So in transportation and in buildings and industry, there are two things you can do. You can improve the efficiency, which reduces how much energy you need, or you can electrify. The reason why you're interested in electrifying is because all renewable energy sources today produce electricity. They don't produce fuel. Well, they don't economically produce fuel. So if we expose everything to electricity, that means the growth in electric demand can feed a growth in renewable energy. All right, that's demand. Oh, one more thing about demand. We're not going to be able to go into it today, but how you move that slider has a lot of details underneath it that you can change in En-ROADS. When you apply the policy, how steep the policy will be, when you end the policy, what part of the economy is affected by it, all those things can change. And in fact, people use this to actually shape what might be effective policy by looking at this detail. We don't have enough time for that. If you want to do that, we can certainly talk afterwards. And when you go home, you can try it out. So what we're going to do is you suggest something either increasing or decreasing, and we're just going to do it all the way. But I'll show you at various times what the implications of that all the way policy are. Here's the most typical supply. This contains all the ways in which people produce electricity deliberately, or produce power, produce energy deliberately. So the three fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. There's renewables, there's nuclear, and then there are three that are maybe a little bit less familiar. One is bioenergy, which I mentioned before, is something like growing corn in the Midwest in order to convert it to ethanol or to stick it in gasoline. The basic idea of that, of course, is that you're growing stuff which takes CO2 out of the air in growth. You're consuming it, which produces CO2 back into the air, But if you regrow the thing all again, you might imagine that you're sort of sucking it back in. It's never perfect. Actually, it's not that close to perfect, but that's the idea behind bioenergy. Non-zero carbon. Many people say, can't we just out-invent this problem? And this gives a slider that is based on your estimation of how quick we could invent something. What we're looking for is something that's on the scale of the energy productivity of coal, let's say. And some ideas might be, there are new kinds of nuclear reactors called thorium. Another idea is, right now, renewables only produce electricity. Could they produce hydrogen directly from sunlight instead of producing electricity, which is then used to electrolyze water? Two-step process, which isn't efficient. Well, in fact, you can do this in the lab, but not very effectively. Who knows? Maybe someone can think of something new to do it. So it allows you to explore what would happen with a disruptive discovery of a new source of energy. And the last thing on this part is carbon price. That charges tax on all fossil fuels, not by how much energy they have, but by how much CO2 they produce. So per energy unit, coal will get more tax because it's the dirtiest. Natural gas will get less tax because it's the cleanest. But natural gas, of course, is still dirty compared to something like solar panels, which have no CO2 production. Now, there's another source of CO2, which isn't connected with mankind trying to develop energy. It has to do with how you use the land and the ability to maybe suck CO2 that's already out there away from the environment. Deforestation, we've heard a lot about that. Afforestation, that's planting trees. Methane and others, cows, burp and fart methane. And a few other animals do also. Furthermore, there are other agricultural practices that could be modified to reduce less methane. And there's the oil industry and gas industry, which inadvertently leak methane through all the piping tubes. And there are other things like refrigerants. So these are all grouped here. And you could have a policy of cracking down on that, or a policy of changing agricultural process, or a policy of subsidizing the change in agricultural process. And the last one here is technological. That's developing something new that could efficiently suck CO2 out and bury it somewhere so that it doesn't get back into the environment. That's actually a two problem, right? To get it out and to figure out a way to stabilize it so it doesn't go back into the air. Well, there are a lot of ideas about that. I just mentioned one of those ideas. We can talk more about that in the future if you want to select that. But that's a way of saying, can we mount a national and international investment in developing ways to remove CO2 that's already there? All right. So we're back to the home page. And what we're trying to do is change that number. So just to be clear, this is a plot of the increase in the global annual temperature over pre-industrial levels throughout the 21st century with policy as usual. Right now, we're at about 1 degree, 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. At the end of this century, if we do nothing, people think it'll be somewhere around 3.6 degrees centigrade, about 3 times hotter relative to pre-industrial levels than now. Here are the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords has as its aim 1.5 degree change. But they say that if it gets above 2 degrees, it's really heading into catastrophic territory. So our aim is basically that. Bend the curve. Bend the curve so that at the end of the 21st century, in the year 2100, the global change in temperature above pre-industrial levels will be somewhere between 1 and 1.5. We're trying to find policy that will do that. That's the end of me. Now it's your turn. Let me just get out the En-ROADS thing. Do any of you want to nominate a policy you want to try? Yes?
I would like to save the koalas and add some trees.
I couldn't-
Save the
trees.
Add
Add
trees.
a-
Add trees.
Afforestation.
Afforestation? All right, afforestation, how much do you think that'll help? How much do you think it'll lower 3.6?
Not a lot, but it might save the koalas.
There's many reasons, of course, to do afforestation. So the question is, how much will it change? All right, we're going to do it. I'm going to take this slider and I'm going to push it all the way to increasing afforestation. It went down 1/10 of a degree centigrade.
On the same note, I heard some experts on TV say there's not enough land on the earth to plant enough trees to get rid of all the carbon that's in the air.
Coming up, I'll show you that visual. All right, so the issue with afforestation is this. This is gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year produced over the 21st century by different sources. So this is fossil fuels, but what's of most relevance to us is this little green strip. That's from burning forests, which are counteracted by the policy we just put in, which causes this to actually drop below zero. But it's only a small sliver. Basically, it's saying that growing trees by themselves is a small slice of all the CO2 that mankind is pumping into the air. It's just another sign of how massive climate change is. So we've made a start, 1/10 degree. But to refer to Cheryl's answer, this is, no, that's not what I want, just a minute. Well, I can't quite get what I want to do, but the answer to your question is that by moving the slider all the way over here, the whole world will have to plant an area twice the size of the country of India. So that's big. It's not undoable, but big. Okay, we've got a 1/10 of a degree. Who wants to suggest something else? Joan?
I heard the other day that there's more methane gas emitted from a turned off gas stove than, I don't know if they said anything else, but it's more than.
So there recently have been studies that come out that say unburnt CO2 in a gas stove or slight leakage from just the stove lines that are insignificant for human health. But when you aggregate them over 40 million stoves in the country, you get something that's noticeable. Well, that's true. However, I would say that's probably dwarfs other sources of methane. But we're going to try it out. How much do you think it'll change?
A little.
I'm going to say 0.2.
0.2.
Good guess.
It's a big change.
Oh, that-
Ooh, yeah.
All right. The reason why it's a big change is because, oh, sorry. Because methane is this blue thing right here. Very little methane is released into the atmosphere compared to CO2. But methane is about 30 or 40 times more effective in CO2 than in causing the greenhouse gas effect. So you're actually multiplying every methane molecule by something like 40 compared to a CO2. So in doing this change, we go from that green down. Furthermore, this particular change that you've suggested includes the other things that are here. That is, there are certain gases that contain fluorine that are still being emitted from refrigerants And for N2O, you're still talking about fertilizer that will emit N2O. So these things are all can be changed. There are laws, no, there are proposed laws in the Senate right now. Senator Whitehorse from Rhode Island, White House from Rhode Island, has proposed a law that will put restrictions on it. The Biden administration is talking about using the EPA authority to restrict some of this. But you got to be careful about what this involves. To get this kind of change, the extreme end, you're going to not only have to plug all those leaks in oil, but you're going to have to change farming. You're going to have to, for instance, with cows, if you feed cows certain kinds of seaweed, they don't burp as much CO2 or as much
Methane.
methane. If we all cut down on meat eating and remove the interest of growing so many cows in this world, we would also affect. So how to actually implement this policy would mean dealing with farmers, dealing with the oil industry, dealing with refrigerants and people who use them, and fertilizer. It would require some substantial changes in how people do things. Yes, Cheryl.
And there was a program on Nova the other day about methane being released from the permafrost in the north, at
Oh,
the North
yeah.
Pole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm not prepared to say how important that problem is, and I don't know if people actually have arrived at a consensus about that. But I can tell you what it's about. So the permafrost is plant vegetation that can grow in the Arctic, but when it dies and collapses, the growing season is so short that bugs do not have enough time to eat it up like they would here.
Oh.
So because the bugs go dormant when it gets really cold. So eons, thousands of years of all this stuff produces what some people call duff, that is all this leftover plant stuff that hasn't been digested by bugs in literally thousands of years. It warms up enough, growing season expands, bugs have more time to eat it, now they're just going to town. The same problem actually feeds forest fires in the Arctic. You don't have to burn trees. You can just burn the ground because you've got 20 or 30 feet in some places of leftover organic debris. It's like these coal mines that happen underground, fires happen underground. They think they put it out and 2 years later they find it still burning. That can also happen in Siberia. Yes?
Okay, I know that with methane, like you could mandate that, you could mandate that landfills capture the methane. A lot of them do. They cap the landfill and then they suck out the methane and they reuse it as fuel. We do it in the Metropolitan Water District here in Chicago. So we did a tour years ago with that. But it seems like with carbon removal, we don't have anything. It says technological. We can remove methane. We have wet methods of doing so. Is there any method of removing carbon that's technological in the mix right
And
now?
reusing, you mean?
Well,
Having the carbon in the atmosphere, we know that, a lot of it comes from coal and oil and such. But technologically, we know with methane, we can suck it out and reuse it. Is there anything we can do with carbon? Right.
do you want to suggest we took the tech button here?
Yes,
Is
please.
that what you're saying? All right, let's hit the tech button. League of Women Voters is a smart group of people, and your choices so far show that. All right, the tech button. By putting in technological change, you do in fact lower stuff by a whole lot. But it's important to understand the scale that we're talking about to do.
Yeah, we will.
And for that, I'm going to go to another plot. All right, so these are several ideas about removing CO2 from the air. Several of these ideas depend upon removing CO2 right from the smokestack. You burn a fossil fuel, and before it gets out the chimney, the CO2 has been sucked out. So remember, this technological removal is a 2-point technical problem. how to get CO2 from a whole bunch of other stuff out and what to do with it so that it doesn't get back in. So we've got already some afforestation, but here is what's called carbon removal and storage built upon bioenergy. So as you recall, bioenergy is when you grow a crop that takes CO2 out, consume it somehow to produce energy, and then regrow, replant the crop, which presumably is going to drag the CO2 that you produce, burning it back out again. It's never perfect. But if you capture the CO2 from the burning process, then the growth stuff is acting like a suction, right? It's sucking CO2 out of the air. You're getting the energy and you're capturing the CO2 before it goes back into the air. So that's a win-win process. But still, that's a lot of CO2. And so this is a representation of that for connected with bioenergy. You could also imagine sucking it right out of the air. That is not from a smokestack. And that's this part right here, the light color. Then there are several other things having to do with, you can convert CO2 into minerals. That's the dark part here. And the yellow part is ways you can bury CO2 by changing agricultural processes and how you turn over crops, like, you know, the corn stalks after you harvest, how you turn them over in ways that prevent CO2 from getting back into the air. These are all possibilities that are not economically feasible, but they could become economic. We could have a national or an international program to invest in how we could do this. Yes.
And that's what I wanted to ask about, is because my understanding is we're still subsidizing fossil fuel extractions.
Oh, yeah.
That we're still what?
Subsidizing with federal dollars, fossil fuel extractions, making it easy for them to do business. So if we rededicated that money to this effort, just took away their federal subsidy, that would be a
Hold that thought.
policy.
Hold that thought. Let me finish this now.
Okay.
Okay, so there are ways to look at how big you have to do this. Show it. No. So I was talking about mineralization. This is where you take CO2 and stick it into minerals in the ground that are not fully oxygenated and can incorporate CO2 to make carbonates that stay in the ground. There are actually places on Earth where the lower mantle that you don't see on the surface is exposed. That would include places in northwest of the US, places in Saudi Arabia. And so people have been talking about drilling a well in and next to it another one, and pumping in concentrated CO2 in water and then sucking the water out the other well, so that what spreads out is the CO2 water solution. The CO2 converts itself into a mineral. It's sort of like reverse oil fields. This is not very economical now, but it's an example of the sort of possibility that you could imagine in the future. But the scale of it, as one might expect, has to be similar to the scale that we're abstracting stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so here we are. This is current coal production that we haven't yet modified by any of these. And this is what this slider, text slider, would imply in the amount of material, billions of tons per year, that we're putting into the ground in the mineralization step. So basically, in order to achieve the kind of this effect here, this subtraction of CO2, we have to reverse the coal industry, right? Pump minerals into the ground that sort of replace the coal that we took out of the ground. And another way of looking at this is
And how much energy would be required
well,
to
that's
do all
all
this?
incorporated into this
Oh, it is.
model.
Oh, okay.
So I presume, well, you know, I think this model includes that, and I think it isn't of great concern, but that's actually a good question that I haven't thought much about. Now, another thing that you can do with CO2 that you capture is if you go deep into the ground, there are salty brine patches in the ground. And you can force CO2 into those brine patches where they're captured and have low likelihood of coming out. So this is another one of these plots that have to do with capture that involves burying like that. The dotted line is the volume of a gas produced by the oil and gas industry. And this part is stuffing stuff down into brine wells. So once again, the basic idea is in order to get this to be important, you have to have a scale that is dealing with the same kind of volumes that typically are being drawn out by the oil industry, only now we're putting it back in.
Cheryl, would you?
I have a couple of questions from our Zoom people. One is, how about solar panels? Where would that fit in?
Well, there's something called renewables here. And if you want, we can just put the slide all the way to the right, which means we're going to subsidize renewables. In this particular slider, if you push it all the way to the right, this renewables thing, you will basically subsidize roughly speaking, half the cost of putting in solar panels or wind farms or something like that. So you want to do that?
Yeah, let's try that.
So anyone want to guess how much that's going to affect it?
0.2,
Yeah, 10%.
What?
0.2.
0.2, let's see.
Oh,
All right.
hey.
Wow.
Let me get back to the, get rid of these and go back. to
Well, we're
the-
getting closer.
All right, so what we've done, let me do this again so you can see the effect. This is what we have now. We're going to subsidize renewables, boom. That's what we have. That's good, 2.4. But there's one thing to notice here. If I can get the right thing. So this is the baseline where we're doing nothing. And the policy we're just pursuing is to subsidize solar panels. So if you look here, nothing much happens for about 15 years, even though we're subsidizing solar panels and other non-renewables. This gets back to something that is haunting all changes towards renewable energy. And I want to illustrate it by buying a car on time. You buy a car on time for 5 years. It has crappy mileage, gasoline mileage, and you crash the car in 2 years in. And you go buy a new car, and the new car has great mileage. But in the end, you're still paying 2 mortgages, one for the original car and one for the great car. And even though your operating expense has been lowered, you're still financing 2 things. Every time you build a coal plant, that plant is generally designed for 30 years worth of use. So even if something great comes along that actually is much more efficient in producing energy with much less pollution, if you just shut off that plant, then you're still going to be in an expensive position. This actually is very relevant to CEJA, the environmental bill passed in Illinois, where Naperville in 2009 invested in a state-of-the-art coal-fired plant with a mortgage that runs into 2040. That plant in 12 years has become in the top 10 of single source CO2 emissions of power plants in the US.
Oh, my God.
And CEJA wanted to cut off any kind of coal production by, I forgot what, 2030 or 2035. Naperville didn't want to do that because they'd be basically paying for a car that's all smashed up and also paying for any new thing. So they held up CEJA for about 2 or 3 months. And the final thing that ended up happening is that CJ got passed. There is no cutoff for the Naperville plant. But after about 2030, they have to install carbon capture, which was the technology we talked about, and bury the CO2 in the ground. And if they can't do that, then they got to shut the plant off. So this is one of the problems about fossil fuel inertia, you might say. And the reason why people were concerned during the COP, the last COP, what was it, 26, I forgot what the heck it was, where India didn't want to put a moratorium on coal-fired plants because most of its power comes from coal-fired plants. Every single coal-fired plant that's built in India for the next 10 or 20 years is itself going to have a lifetime of 30 years. And it's going to cause a problem, an economic. Okay.
Two more questions here. One about reducing the use of plastic. And the other is electric cars for everybody.
Okay. So reducing the cost of plastic.
Not the
isn't
cost, the
really-
use,
Pardon?
the use of plastic.
Reducing the use of plastic isn't really a big deal energy-wise. I'm all in favor of reducing plastic. But that's really a discussion apart from how to combat climate change. It has to do with, I mean, plastics are forever compounding. That's the real reason to be opposed to them. They just don't go away. You have to do something to dispose of them. The other thing was
Electric cars.
electric cars. All right, there's a slider here. Does anyone want to predict what the slider will show?
Is that the electrification one?
So the electric car is right here.
0.1.
So if everybody in the world had an electric car instead of a gasoline
Yeah,
car,
so,
0.1.
0.1?
so what do you think it's going to change?
I think it'll change it quite a bit, yeah.
Anyone want to give a guess?
4 tenths.
You're right, Vicky. 0.1, Vic, 1.1. Vicky got it. And that's a big change from.
Vicky got it. Vicky guessed right.
Yeah, yeah. So let me return to
Wow.
the standard thing.
Get rid of coal too.
What happens?
Yeah, get rid of coal.
As you can see with electrification,
Get rid of what?
Coal.
what happens is that
It's my wish list.
The blue line.
is that the renewables, the green, grow. But if you look carefully, the brown grows also.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta build the cars.
So basically, anything that electrifies is a good thing. But if you haven't changed the source of electricity, then everything that generates electricity
It's gonna go up.
is liable to be able to supply the demand created by new electric cars. Let me, I'll get you in just, let me just finish one more thing here. Well, that's it. Okay, what did you want?
How about nuclear? Adding
Nuclear.
more nuclear.
Okay. So first of all, nuclear is a very thin slice over the top.
Okay.
So this slider on nuclear, if put all the way here, will basically subsidize about half the nuclear cost. You want to do it?
Sure, why not?
Really, your voice is making me.
Scaring us.
Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be helping the situation again, but I'll save the koalas and maybe some jobs. I don't know.
All right, we're gonna do it, and it does change things by about 1/10 degree. But there is something special about nuclear,
Look how big it got there.
which
Well, yeah,
is
yeah.
not true for other things. Right. We're in 2020. And we subsidize half of a nuclear cost. But nothing much happens till about 2035. The reason why is it takes 15 freaking years.
To build a
generally
plant.
speaking, to go through all the hoops necessary to open a nuclear power plant. Now, of course, we could legislatively attempt to address that. But in the context of this, it just takes a long time to operate a nuclear power plant. It does improve things, but the approval improved part, you can see it right here.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things about the approval part is it can compete with other renewables. Let's see if I can get this to go.
Wow.
So you see how the green shrinks actually.
Right.
So as you grow nuclear, which is a non-carbon producing thing, you compete with renewables, which are and you compete with everything, all the other energy. But so that somewhat limits its effectiveness. In a sense, nuclear and renewables are kind of linked together.
One of the things.
Yes.
Al, what if you took the coal all the way down to zero?
Yeah,
Let's see what
tax the
happens.
living daylights out of coal.
Yes.
Well, not the
Yeah,
living.
let's see what happens.
I feel bad for
Yeah.
it.
So coal in this slider
Mhm.
would go up a little more than a factor of 2, the cost. We got another 2/10. But one of the things about coal, it's persistent. And the reason why it's persistent is that it's ubiquitous. Lots of countries have coal. And that the technology of the supply chain, how you get coal to heat places or produce electricity, is low tech. You don't need it. You know, any developing country knows what to do about coal. And so even if something like solar panels might seem, an interesting opportunity for, I don't know, New Guinea, or something like that. Whether there's the knowledge infrastructure to maintain that is another matter. So coal remains resistant at this level, that is doubling its cost, doesn't make it go all the way. That's
So when you reduce the coal to zero, would that automatically increase the carbon price or no?
carbon price has nothing to do with these slides. So all that's happening here is we're just taxing coal. And what we're doing with the tax is unspecified in this model.
So the taxing is not the same as carbon pricing?
No.
Oh, okay. Somebody
Carbon
suggested,
price isn't coal-based. Carbon price is for any fuel that produces CO2. And it's taxed according to CO2, the CO2 units that it produces.
so could we try raising that carbon price?
Well, let's ask Victoria first.
In order to produce any of these technological changes or add electric cars or add any kind of electrical stuff, don't we need to extract these rare earth minerals for batteries and stuff?
Oh, wow.
And so the extraction industry itself is extremely carbon based and you build all these machines and you dig all these holes and you need all this energy to run these things. And you have to transport this stuff. Is that all built in when you reduce something?
I'm not necessarily ready to say that it's energy intensive. That is a problem. And I think that's probably at a level where this model doesn't include enough to say much about the cost of how you do electronics with rare earths. The latest issue of Chemical and Engineering News talks about training bugs to extract
Bugs,
Training board, huh?
microorganisms.
microorganisms.
Oh,
Yeah.
Set bugs on a pile of stuff that's been ground up from some kind of mine. And you can grow bugs that prefer certain kinds
Oh, geez.
of these rare minerals.
So the part 2 was, can we make these rare earths? Can we artificially create them by breaking up some of these molecules of other stuff we can't figure out what to do with?
So let's be clear, rare earths are elements.
They're
so
elements,
they
that's
can't
what I
be
thought,
produced.
so we can't. They're
What
not
you're talking
carbon.
about is they're in various compounds.
Mhm.
Where do we find them and how do we liberate them from whatever they're in so
Okay.
that we can use them for other things?
So we can't get down to that below subatomic level and create them.
Yes.
My other part was we're ignoring the oceans, which are expanding. I don't see anything in here that addresses the fact that their heat sinks or that they're getting more salinated or less salinated, becoming more acidic. And so,
You're talking about the oceans here.
yeah, just the oceans in general. How does that fit into this model? Because we're getting more oceans because we've got less polar caps.
The way the oceans figure into this model, and I could show it, there's an impact part to this model. that impact part will take your favorite coastal city and show you how much is going to be threatened at high tide in the year 2100. It's scary. So the economic effect of that is at some level built in, but not at the granularity that we can say, our mines or resources that are along the coast going to be buried because of rising ocean. I think generally what we see is that oceans rise by a few feet, which do threaten coastal cities, but they're not going to really impact too much the energy production.
But the oceans are going to suck up more CO2, and that's why they become more acidic.
Oh, yeah.
And there's,
Just one of
which
many
is
factors.
killing a food source, which has an economic impact.
Yeah, I think that aspect is probably incorporated. I'm going to follow up on Cheryl's idea now about carbon.
Hit them where it hurts. Not
So,
pocket.
Carbon tax in this model will probably more than double and maybe triple the cost, somewhere between double and triple the cost of fossil fuels. There are many, many ways of imposing carbon tax. So this is going to be a very blunt discussion. The details really matter. But carbon tax will simultaneously affect all fossil fuels. So you're not going to have squeezing coal allowing natural gas to flourish. All of them are going to be affected together. So here we go. We're going to raise the carbon price all the way.
Whoa, that's a big change.
It turns out
0.6.
that the carbon price is the single most effective thing you can do at this level. And the reason why it is because the carbon tax steadily increases over time to a level where power plants are shut down. People are discouraged from building a new one because they know over the lifetime of the plant, they're going to be faced with costs that are very high.
This,
Let me finish, okay? And then you can ask the question. However, this model is incomplete about carbon tax. And that's because a carbon tax will dramatically increase initially the price of energy. You're in a sense forcing a transition. And the oodles of money are going to have to be spent at increased energy costs. But at the same time, the unique aspect of carbon tax is that what are you going to spend the tax on? So I don't know if you can see this here, because we've got several other things. This part right here. This part right here, I think, is the amount of money that's coming into the coffer because we imposed the carbon tax. The scale here is trillions. So you're talking about every year, $5 trillion. What are we going to do with that money? Well, here's where the creative aspects of the carbon tax can come to play. A country could decide, oh, well, I'll just pay off my national debt, or maybe I'll build a bigger army. But in the US, this has been discussed in Build Back Better. There are at least 3 bills, one from Senator Whitehouse, one from Dick Durbin, and one from 2 in the House that have been introduced that are all about this. And what they vary mostly is what they're going to spend the money on. So most of these bills want to return the money to the citizens. The government is only a collector. It takes maybe 1% off the top for just shuffling the money around. And it wants, most of these want the money to go to households independent of how much energy they use. A single mother with 2 kids in Los Angeles and a rich couple with a 3,000 square foot house in Connecticut with 2 kids, they're going to get the same amount of money back. So what that means ultimately is that the single mom can pay those higher prices, but the family in Connecticut will have to dig deeper to pay it. But more importantly, these refunds occur whether or not you use any fossil fuels. So if you get off the fossil fuel wagon, you get community solar.
Oh, okay.
You know, you hook up to windmills. Hey, you're getting money from the government every month because some poor other sucker refused to do that.
Yeah.
Of course, it isn't so easy. All your gas taxes will go, all your gas prices will go up. You know, everything that a lot of stuff, businesses, all that, they're gonna have to scramble for trying to find non-fossil fuel ways of getting the energy necessary to do their business. So it's complicated, it's serious. But you can stage it in many different ways. I mean, maybe in this particular case, we raise the cost, we raise the tax over like 10 or 15 years. You could raise it over 50 years, 60 years. What happens is that as long as people know, as long as industry knows that this is the framework they're operating in, then they adjust however they can. So it is true that this carbon tax is one of the most important things that you could do to change climate change. But this model is incomplete because what you do with the tax matters. And if you do the wrong thing, like pay off the national debt, you'll have a depression.
Yeah.
And put a lot of people out of the very poor people you want to help, you're going to put them all out of work. The rich will find a way to save them. So it's very complicated. But this is a way to turn off fossil fuels and encourage renewables.
But you said that would close all the coal plants within a certain number of years. What about all the people that work in the coal industry?
Yeah. So of course, the claim of many people is the energy has to come back somehow. So there are jobs somewhere. It's just not in the fossil fuel. You could imagine lots of people wanting to electrify heating and cooling. In this part of the country, I mean, we use natural gas. Hardly anyone thinks about electricity. But if this were to happen, a wise thing for a homeowner to do would be to invest in an electric furnace. Somebody's got to do that. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
However, the thing about it is it's called a tax, but it isn't really a tax in the sense that the citizens get it all back. It's just how it's distributed. That's one of the reasons why it remained important in the Build Back Better negotiations. It won't affect the deficit at all. Okay, we've actually succeeded. We've gotten to 1.4 degrees, and it's a little bit after 11. So
Solve the world problem.
I'd like to do one thing that they encourage to do in training, and I'm going to try it on you for the first time. When you get to this stage in training, they encourage you to spend 1 minute of silence thinking about what you can do about this. So I'm going to do that now. For 1 minute, I'm going to be quiet. This is hard. It'll take years, but it will be worth it. We should all feel like the Blues Brothers that we're on a mission. Do something about it. Thank you very much.
How do we get to this site again? What's the link that we use to get to this site?
You just Google En-ROADS, EN-ROADS, ROADS, simulator.
Oh, okay.
Probably En-ROADS enough, is just enough. And something will come up, look for climate interaction. If you're interested in it, you can try it out yourself. There is online training available all the time. The training is quite good. And if you do it, you'll meet people from all over the world because
Yeah.
this is used everywhere.
You said some senators did this and representatives, about half of the representatives and senators.
So, every election year, there's a change in who's in the House of Representatives and who's in the Senate. But at one time, before the last election, about a half of the senators have been exposed to this. and
But
about
none
a
of them
third
know how to read.
So I myself was with a group of people who exposed it to Marie Newman at lobbying.
Oh.
To get back, maybe I can.
Wondering what Marjorie Taylor Greene's thoughts about this.
She's gonna call the Gazpacho police.
If you do that, please video it. I wanna watch.
Probably busy then.
We have to send a children's book to her to
I'm gonna
understand
just,
it.
hopefully I can just call up some stuff here real quick. Yeah. You can letter write and phone call. You know, these congressmen, we all know, they love to hear from you. And you can question at town hall meetings and candidate forums. I intend to go to as many as I can and ask them some question about climate change. And you can join supporting lobbying groups. So Citizens Climate Lobby, I belong to, they're the ones that have taken on the mission of trying to get past carbon price. And I have been with them in lobbying Marie Newman to get her to support one of the bills for climate price, and she did. You can join a general organization like the Sierra Club. That's always on the outlook for federal legislation that improves the environment of all different kinds. And if you are religiously motivated, this is an example of a Catholic lobbying group for environment, motivated by the religious feelings of Catholics. So there's all sorts of things you can do.
Just the other day, there was something on the news about some new, is it fission or fusion? Whatever's the
so-
one that they don't use now. I
I
can't
don't
remember.
remember exactly what that is.
Yeah, there's some new development they say could really make atomic
Yeah.
energy a little bit.
So it was about fusion.
Okay, thank you.
And fusion, sure enough, is one of those things that fall under the rubric of non-zero carbon sources.
Okay.
The only thing I'll say about fusion is that my career in science lasted 50 years. And every 10 years, people would say, we're 20 years away from practice. So I'll need a little more than someone
Okay.
saying. they made a
See me in 20 years.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you know what the numbers are on population? Is it declining?
We're gonna talk about that in great decisions. Yes, they are.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially in certain areas.
So the population, this is a plot of the population as predicted by the UN over the 21st century. So it's still increasing,
Okay.
but
Interesting.
it has an error bar. Full width and half maximum of the bell curve. It's sort of like 67% chance of being either within this high level or within this low level.
Okay.
So if I hit the slider for population to decrease it.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
That's growth to
is
zero.
that we'll reach a maximum
Yeah.
before 10 billion. And we'll be on the road. Now, when people look at this, I don't want people to conjure up the notion of China. One of
Right.
the-
I was just gonna say,
Rather, the more important thing is that the zillion studies show that as you educate women throughout the world,
Right.
they become part of the workforce. They have lower numbers of kids and they have greater economic security. So you could imagine a big international effort to ensure that women all over the world are educated, and that would change the population. Most of the population growth is not in the developed countries. It's in the undeveloped. So,
Somebody at home is saying, there was, something was announced about a new jet fuel using ethanol that would be 70% free of CO2. I don't know if that's something you know about.
I haven't heard that, and I don't know exactly. You know, what people have to appreciate is that combustion, which is what happens in the jet engine, and what's happening to your stove, what happens in your car. Complete combustion does one thing. It takes hydrocarbons and turns them into CO2 and water. There's no other possibilities unless you talk about generating CO, it's the CO2, in which case you're poisoning people. So, you know, if someone says some sort of 70% reduction, maybe what they mean is that by using bioenergy, where you're growing the corn that produces the ethanol that goes into fuel, that you're recovering a lot of what you burn by the growth of next year's corn crop.
Okay.
Maybe they believe that.
Thank
All
you.
right,
This
thanks
is
a lot.
excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah. Oh, no, that was Mary Jo. Oh, that was Mary Jo.
Stop recording.
Oh, yeah.